one reason for telling you that story is that I'm going to try to cover a fair amount of ground with you here as time allows. But it's really important to me that you understand, that I understand, that what you're looking at here is not anybody of great wisdom. Yes, I've been a few places, been a few miles, but I'm not an expert on anything. You would say, well, you've been in journalism long enough to be an expert on journalism. But that's not exactly true. But I'm not an expert on anything. There may be experts on the future of global relationships, maybe experts on what's happening in the cosmos, but if so, you'd be surprised how few of them graduated from Sam Houston State Teachers College. And I hope you'll keep that in mind as we go along. I do want to talk about what I consider to be the crisis in American journalism and why every American should care. I know many of you in this room are already practicing journalists. Some of you in the room are aspiring journalists. I know you take your work and your aspirations seriously. So I hope you'll bear with me as we go through this and you say, gosh, he's pretty serious about that. I am serious about it. I don't take myself seriously, but I do take my work seriously. I feel we need to do so in this case at this time because American journalism is in trouble. And if you believe, as I do, that a free, truly free press, independent, fiercely independent, when necessary, press is the red beating heart of democracy, then it's not a special plea of journalists when I say journalism is in crisis. It's something every American should care and care deeply about. But consistently I find people saying, well, why should anyone outside of this room really care? Any more than if I were to say that American sitcoms are in trouble, or that American popular music is in trouble, or any of the many other amusements, distractions, or even art carried out by that vast entity called the media. I know there seem to be rhetorical strawmen to which you might expect any crowd, journalist or none, to respond dutifully with talk of news being a public service, news perhaps even an essential public service, which I believe it to be. But let's ask the question as if we really mean it. Because you can answer a question two kinds of ways, with your lips and with your hips. And too often the value of journalism is given plenty of lip service without anyone making a move to support it. Not owners and operators of news outlets, not the reading, viewing, and listening public, and at times not, though it pains me to say it, we journalists ourselves. Before I go any further, I need to say that I do not exclude myself from this criticism. I very much include myself in this and any critiques that follow. It strikes me that we have a collective choice to make in this country about whether we really mean what we say when we say news is important. And in framing this choice, instead of saying American journalism is in trouble, perhaps we should say, more accurately, American democracy is in trouble, because you cannot separate the two. Our nation's founders put freedom of the press alongside freedom of speech and religion in the very First Amendment of the Constitution, not because they had any particular fondness for newspapers. You can read all sorts of statements by men such as Jefferson about what he considered to be the scurrilous nature of early American journalism. And for the most part, the statements are true. Our early founders did not really like newspapers or newspaper people. No, our founders put freedom of the press at the beginning of the Bill of Rights because they recognized that the free and open exchange of ideas was absolutely essential to a democratic society and a free people. And that they knew that if we, the people, were really going to be entrusted with running the country, then we, the people, had better have access to the facts, to good information on which to base our collective decisions. In this age when we hear so much talk about the, quote, media, I still prefer to say instead the press, where news is concerned, whether it's news in print, on television, radio, or on the Internet, because the First Amendment doesn't guarantee, quote, freedom of the media. It says freedom of the press. The press, in my mind, refers to news that has this constitutional mission at its core, no matter what the means by which the news is delivered. The media, on the other hand, is that vast landscape of what is now called, quote, content. Some of it is informative, some of it even looks like news. But the underlying impetus of the media is to entertain, and by entertaining, generate a profit. So with this in mind, we can go on pretending that the news we see today reflects its intended central role in the health of our nation, or we can take a real look in the mirror during which we might see the following: a growing homogenization of traditional news sources, the byproduct of ever more lax government regulations on media ownership, and the rush of conglomerates, not always news or even media conglomerates, to take advantage of these regulations. What is this man talking about? Frame of reference. In the 1950s, there were some 54 to 57 news organizations, print, radio, and television, that were considered to have national distribution, or at the very least, widespread and multi-regional distribution. Well over 50. Today, in terms of national distribution of news, no more than 6, my count is 4, very large international conglomerates control the national distribution of the news that most Americans receive. I submit to you that whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, a Tea Party member, or a mugwump, that this is something to be concerned about. So one of the things is what I call the conglomerization of the news. My general criticism, both of those of us in the news, consumers of the news, and people who own the outlets. In my lifetime, and indeed the latter part of my lifetime, the news has become, and forgive this, some of these are not even proper English words, the news has become corporatized, politicized, and trivialized. Now, besides this development, there's an unseemly deference in the press to power, which is perhaps to be expected when so many news outlets are owned by very large corporations with manifold interests in Washington, interests that are often at odds with candid reporting. These very large corporations have regulatory interests. They have regulations they want passed in their favor. They have regulations they want stopped to help them their bottom line. They have interest in securing government contracts, everything from defense contracts to infrastructure contracts. They have interests that too often add up to a news philosophy of don't rock the boat, because if our news entity, which is usually a small part of the overall corporate conglomerate, if it rocks the boat, it may affect the widespread profits of the corporation as a whole. Now, another thing has developed. We have reached the point where a forum that pretends to give citizens the world, but instead presents a far too narrow slice of safe and sanctioned ideas, thought, and lines of inquiry, a place that has become an echo chamber for stories generated initially in a precious few places along the Washington-New York axis. Too often this is what now passes for, quote, news. Also, we've become an institution that for all of its resources, which have been shrinking dramatically, for all of the hard-won knowledge and day-to-day familiarity that the best journalists bring to the job, our craft is now scared to death to offer almost any independent judgment. Heaven forbid that we should follow up what the president, a senator, a congressman, a governor, or mayor says with some independent fact-based truth squatting, some good old-fashioned vetting of an elected representative's remarks. Not when we have available to us the safe route, which is to get someone from an opposing party or ideological camp to present their own competing spin. It's also developed a maddening reluctance to ask the all-important follow-up question of people in high places. Too often, we journalists ask what seems at first like a probing, substantive question. It seems that way. But after an answer that amounts to pure spin, we won't offer a follow-up that has a chance to call the subject on their spin. We're all too happy to play gotcha journalism when it comes to stories of prurient interest, sex scandals, celebrity trials, and the like. But when it comes to matters of true national and worldwide importance, we journalists too often have lost our guts. We need a spine transplant because now we suddenly become polite to the point of ineffectiveness, to the point of providing a megaphone for officially sanctioned propaganda. And speaking of the prurient, who among us will be the first to pledge a moratorium on filling the ever-shrinking news hole with garbage such as round-the-clock coverage of Anna Nicole Smith's drama or whatever's happening to Paris Hilton? Do any of us in this room think that this kind of so-called news is important? Do any of us think that Americans in some way lack other venues for learning about celebrities? I don't mean to sound callous, but in the case of Anna Nicole Smith, and I just picked that case out of one many examples, she was a woman who, by all accounts, and there were many, had a sad life and sadder death. But the day I'll no longer find that coverage odious and beneath us is the day we make room for wall-to-wall coverage of the lives of each soldier killed in the line of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. But given the amount of grief that Ted Koppel received for merely listing the names of the war dead, as he did to his credit, we may not be seeing that anytime soon, which is to say, stories about the lives of soldiers killed in the line of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan that receives anywhere near the kind of play that the celebrity of the day, Lindsay Lohan, whomever, receives. And finally, with the current political season very much in mind, we might see, as we journalists look in the mirror, and as you, the consumers of journalism, look at us, a press that remains transfixed with behind-the-scenes campaign stuff, polls, and the political horse race, while consistently giving the issues and the real behind-the-scenes stories short shift. The biggest story in any modern American political campaign is the money. Who gives how much to whom, expecting to get what? That is the core of what should be reported about campaigns. Remember, I include myself in this criticism. It's what you hear all too seldom. Now, it's true that one reason you hear it all too seldom is in both parties, and even in some of the fringe parties, there's no transparency. If you try to find out in many cases who gave how much to whom, expecting to get what you run into is, sorry, you can't know that information, Mr. Journalist, which means you, Mr. and Ms. Voter, cannot find that information. Now, how many stories did we see at the close of this year's first fundraising quarter on the money race in this off-year election? I would submit to you, not many. And if you think about it, how many stories did you see quoting a poll about who's up this hour or this day, and compare that with the number of stories you saw exposing who gave how much to whom, expecting to get what? What you're going to see is on the poll list and the horse race coverage, a long list of stories. What you're going to see about the money, other than with very few exceptions, is about yay much. Yet out of all those stories, how many of these pieces delved into just where the money was coming from and why? Of all the stories you've seen, think about it for a second. And will we ever see follow-up pieces after a politician is elected that look at legislation, regulation that he proposed or wanted to stop, and appointments, and connect the dots to campaign contributions? You may see a few of those stories. I'll give you a Texas guarantee you will not see many, if any.